Piyush, I want to thank you very much for joining us and engaging in this conversation with us and kicking things off. And just in full disclosure, I'm writing a case on DBS Bank, so I am deeply immersed in the DBS story. But before we go into the DBS story, Piyush, I want to humanize leadership for everybody to understand what is it like to be a leader. And we all understand that DBS's current vision is to be the best bank for a better world. But I want to start with your personal purpose. How does this gel with your personal purpose in life? How does it fit into your own sense of legacy that you may want to leave behind one day when you end up leaving DBS? So maybe let's connect it to you, and then we will continue into DBS.
All right, Ranjay, thanks. And it's a pleasure to be able to chat with you. Also to figure that, we have some ex-colleagues, etc., on this program. Um, you know, I, I think maybe I'm going to start with a little story from my history and connect you back to how I started thinking about purpose. As you heard, I joined City straight out of business school. And through my 20s and 30s, like a lot of other young people who joined large organizations, my horizon there was professional success. So how do you do the big jobs? How do you get the big promotions? How do you get to be the youngest managing director? That kind of stuff. And then in 2000, I made a choice to try my hand at .com, the first internet revolution. So I went and set up a .com. I went back to India. Like many other people, the .com turned out to be a dot bomb, didn't work. And so 7, 8 months down the road, I was really on the horns of a massive dilemma. Didn't know what to do with my life. I was 40 years old. I had 2 kids. And I was sitting there figuring, do I want to go back to internationally, go back to banking? I had a couple of people who wanted me to try some more entrepreneurial activities. I could stay back in India and do something else. And, I've gone public. I spent 2, 3 very traumatic months, a lot of anxiety, learned meditation, etc. And then um, I had this epiphany along the way. The epiphany was really this, that, you know what, I really enjoy banking. I think I'm good at it. I enjoy it. And I think I know how to make a difference as a banker. And so I decided to go back to banking, but with a really profound shift in my mental makeup from looking and striving for professional success to an agenda of going back to banking because it is something I enjoy and an area in which I could make impact. And so that mental mind shift, which is this is about what I enjoy doing and where I can make impact, was quite important. Many years later, in fact, actually, 10 years later, I got involved with some work done by the Authentic Leadership Institute from Harvard, actually. And they do the same exercise. They spend half a morning wanting you to try and capture your own purpose and put it in a pithy sentence. And on more reflection, the sentence I came up with for myself was really that to help shape tomorrow's world. I do believe I have some strengths. I have the capacity to look around corners a little bit, and I'm good. I'm a good executor, and I have deep domain knowledge. So I figure if you can put all these together, the world is changing, and what people are going to need from finance, financial services, banks is going to change. How they do their banking is going to change. If I can play a role in helping shape that and create impact, that would be the best legacy I can leave for myself. And so I guess that story sort of defines my purpose. And I was lucky when I joined DBS, and very early in my career with DBS, I ran a poll with the people trying to figure out the same question of what is the soul of the company and what should the soul of the company be. I was really thunderstruck because the number one thing that came back to me from 1,000 people was DBS is a company with purpose. Now you can imagine this is like 12, 15 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, when purpose was not the buzzword it is today. And for that to come back to me was quite special. I realized then that DBS had this thing very deeply rooted because it had been formed as a development bank in the 60s. It had been formed with the very express intent of helping in the industrialization and development of Singapore. And we talked to the old timers, went back to the archives. It's quite clear that P&L was not a consideration for the first 10 years. The only rubric of decision making was is this good for Singapore or not good for Singapore? And when we acquired the POSB along the way, They have a tagline. They had a tagline called "Neighbors First, Bankers Second." Again, the whole idea was how to institutionalize the savings habit in the country. So this notion that this was a platform which is already deeply immersed in the idea of making a difference and doing real things for real people jived really well with my mindset and where I was in my own personal journey of trying to make an impact and trying to make a difference.
Piyush, that's actually a very helpful answer, and I think it's important for all of us to think about it. That when should we be engaging with our own purpose? I thought I'd ask you, like in the last 3 years, which have been quite unusual, extraordinary years, what have been kind of the some big challenges where you really had to think hard about, the purpose of DBS, your own life purpose? You had to make some big decisions, I'm sure. Some of them may have kept you up at night. Tell us a little bit about some big things that you had to deal with in the last 3 years that were key moments, if you will, that really like Tylenol type moments, where you are really forced to confront, like, okay, what are we gonna do?
Ranjay, I'm going to be very boring on this question. The short answer is we didn't see too many of the Tylenol kind moments. And it really speaks to the kind of company we built over time. So you think about the big issues that we had to face. One, everybody was in lockdown, nobody could come out. We'd spent the last 6 years focusing relentlessly on how do you make things easy and convenient for the customer to do their banking from anywhere, anytime. So that just played into our strength and a pathway that we'd already gone down. Now we had to double down, and we suddenly realized that we had a lot of last mile gaps in journeys we thought we'd completed. So we had to put a lot more effort and energy in finishing those last mile gaps. And it's not a trial moment, but obviously you got to reallocate resources. So we had to, immediately start thinking of putting investment dollars behind the customer convenience agenda as opposed to the next product innovation, for example. We had to worry about employees. How do you get the employees to be able to work from home and work from anywhere? Again, this is not new because we've already well embarked on this journey to create convenient, remote access for our people and to do it in a cyber secure way. So, most companies got there. I'd like to believe you were very quick. It took us like a couple of days to get all of our employees, including our tech resources out of India and Hyderabad, working in real time from anywhere. So that wasn't too much of a challenge either. The question that would normally have arisen is how do you deal with your customers who are going to be economically challenged? And we have a lots of customers, with housing loans, credit card bills to pay, loans to pay, and typically banks are quite careful about giving largesse to these customers or giving them too many degrees of freedom because banking is quite well known. The minute you let payments slide, you're going to run into delinquency challenges. So the best way to keep your credit costs low is to be very, very disciplined in your collections function and your payment capability. Well, this was, you could argue, the big question. Very early, it was quite clear the customers are not going to be able to service. The incomes have been decimated, nobody's going out, shopkeepers are not selling. So it doesn't matter how much I dial up my collections resources and push the credit agenda. You've got to recognize the reality of the customer's cash flow situation. And so we very early launched programs which gave customers free moratorium. We gave them extensions. We said, you can take a year longer to pay. You can take 6 months longer to pay. In reality, it turned out to be not very hard because governments came along very quickly. And so I still remember we launched the programs maybe 4 weeks or 8 weeks before most national governments came up with similar programs. And when the government stepped up with similar programs, the reality is that it made it easier for us to ride on government support. The governments came up with moratorium and guarantee and support programs, etc. So, in all honesty, we were out by ourselves on a limb with a way of thinking, but it didn't last more than a couple of months before the government stepped in and provided us some help as well. The big challenge for me in this period has actually interestingly been, how do you keep mental well-being and mental health going, principally for your employees. In the early days, everybody said this is super cool. I don't need to, commute to work. I'm being more productive. I can do a lot more. 6 months down the road, as all of the people on this call obviously know, mental fatigue starts setting in. The lines between professional and personal start blurring more and more. And because you're not interacting socially with other people, loneliness starts getting to you. So we had to spend a lot of time really engaged and thinking about how do you deal with this problem. We created a program called Together, and it's got some 7, 8 attributes I'm not going to get into. But we were very conscious and very deliberate about creating a level of engagement and focusing on the mental health issues for people. So that's in the context of work. And then, frankly, like everybody else, when India and Indonesia and all were really going through turmoil, we managed to make sure that all our employees and, frankly, the bank, we were able to pitch in and do the good stuff of getting oxygen and concentrators and so on, that kind of stuff. But I have to hasten to add, I genuinely look back and look at these 3 years and say this is a payoff for things that we've been doing over time. There was no seminal moment where we had to go back and really rethink our fundamentals.
Piyush, thank you for that. As you moved into this kind of digital era, and you talked about accelerating your move into the as a digital bank in the last 3 years, what do you think are some of the moral dimensions or the ethical challenges leaders are going to, like yours, who are embarked on this digital journey, are going to face in the years ahead? And how are you thinking about these challenges, whether it's privacy, artificial intelligence, and how are you going to kind of muster the courage to tackle some of them? Because it is going to require a lot of kind of courage, if I may say, to really come up with a principled and disciplined stance on some of these issues.
I've often said that I think the challenges of the next decade are not going to be challenges of STEM, or STEM alone. They're going to be challenges of philosophy. I think the questions we have to grapple with is what makes us society, what makes us human beings, what makes us different from machines, what is the right thing to do. And therefore, if you look at our hiring today, I'm hiring anthropologists, I'm hiring ethnographers, we're having major philosophical discourses on what is the right thing to do. Let me give you two or three examples of things that are obvious, but that do bother me. One is just the exclusion nature of technology. By and large, technology is inclusive. The standard line you'll hear, which is true, is technology brings costs down, and therefore you can bring a lot more people into the financial net. If you look at some of the programs in countries like India and Indonesia, hundreds of millions of people have been brought into the financial net just because on a mobile phone you can do things you can't do otherwise. But there is the other side of it too. Technology can be exclusionary. One of the things that happens is that as you start reducing physical cash, as you start reducing physical branches and branch footprint, as you start reducing ATMs, then you will find at the margins the elderly, the uneducated, the illiterate who might start getting excluded. This is a challenge because, and the simple way to define it is I'm trying to get out of cash or trying to get out of check. But if I'm left with 10 people who still think that's the only way to bank, well, the cost of servicing each of them will be $1 million. Now, how do you make that balance between the tail end and between what you think is the right way for the majority to be able to go? In Scandinavia and Northern Europe, it's instructive. Bank branches are down to about a third, 30% or less of what they used to be, and which is generally all very good. But last year, the Swedish parliament set up a commission to really look at saying, should we set up a floor and say beyond that, we don't want bank branches to be shut because then they start trying to, winding up creating the exclusion problem. I'll give you another example. Now, this is more to do with the data. We're all very happy because data really lets you make better quality decisions, gets you both for the consumer, for us, from our standpoint, our risk management disciplines. From the consumer standpoint, we know a lot more about the consumer, so we can do better things and better product. But data also has the challenge of being exclusionary, and the best example of thinking about is insurance. The way the insurance industry works, it is premised on the notion that you don't have enough information. Nobody knows. And since nobody knows where the risk is, we're all willing to mutualize the risk. We share it. But what happens when you have enough information and so people do know where the risk is? If in a room of 700 people, we know that Piyush Gupta is the only person who's got the cancer gene, the other 699 do not. I can tell you the insurance model breaks down because the 699 don't want to share the premium. They know they don't have cancer, and nobody wants to insure Piyush Gupta anymore. So the challenges of when can information be too much? When can information cause us to rethink how we think of ourselves as a common society with common burdens and common responsibilities? I think that's a moral dilemma we're going to have to come to terms with and deal with as we go ahead. So, or you take AI, increasingly AI is doing more and more of the stuff that we do in the human brain. But what makes AI okay and where do you start drawing the line? It's not easy. All my life as a banker, I've been trained in one premise that I'm trained to make good risk decisions. So the idea is I should not give money to people who will not be able to return money to me. And that's what our credit people do day in and day out. Make a judgment on your credit worthiness. Now, what happens when I take the same process of making a judgment and enshrine it in a set of rules and code and let the machine make those decisions? Now you start getting outcomes that people are not comfortable with. You can get redlining, you can get geographical discrimination, you can get racial discrimination, but that's because that's what the data is showing. Now, how do you make the balance between relying on data to make those kinds of decisions, but also recognizing maybe the other softer, nuanced, and personal elements that we need to be thinking about? So I think over the next decade, these are the kinds of challenges we're going to face. Challenges of privacy, what should I know, what should I not know? Challenges of choice, challenges of exclusion. Each of these has a moral dimension.
Very helpful, Piyush. One other question, since you mentioned earlier that the purpose of DBS is being the best bank for a better world, and the better world kind of has a ring of stakeholder capitalism in it, which in America is getting tremendous heat from all directions. At the one extreme, people are saying this is business is doing purpose washing. At the other extreme, you have right wing people saying that no, wait a minute, you need to businesses should focus on shareholders, and this is undemocratic to have a business leader involved in social issues. They should be not get distracted. How do you reconcile yourself in this space? Do you think stakeholder capitalism is good for business? Or is it something that is being imposed on you by regulators or investors? How does it play into your calculus as a leader of a prominent bank?
So, Ranjay, let me first make sure that I simplify and explain the other side of the argument. It's not the side I'm on, but Milton Friedman, in his seminal work, is not an idiot. I mean, he has a legitimate point of view, and it really boils down to effectively this: that company's job is to create profits. Companies should not be the arbiter of what's good for society. We have governments and other people to do that. And frankly, if you want to do social good, give the money back to the shareholder, let him decide what social good needs to be done. And you start understanding the power of what he's saying when you personalize the equation. So suppose you, Ranjay Gulati, give 10,000 bucks to an asset manager or a private bank to invest for you. The private bank comes back and says, "Hey, Ranjay, I did really well. I made a 20% return. I made 2,000 bucks or 200 bucks on your thousand. But I took the decision to take 100 of that and give it to the beggar down the road because I felt sorry for him. And therefore, I'm only giving you 100 back." Now, that is the question. Is it legitimate for your friend or your private bank asset manager to give the 100 bucks on your behalf? Or would you rather say, I gave you the money, you give me my 200 bucks, I'll decide who I give it to, right? And that's Milton Friedman's argument. So it's not a silly argument at all. The reason I'm on the other camp and the reason this thing is, I boiled it down to two or three things. As you can imagine, I've given it some thought. The first is this: that I think we got to recognize that when companies get created, whether you're a limited liability company or any form of organization, you give life to a legal form, you give life to a legal entity. This legal entity comes with all kinds of rights and responsibility. The principal right you get is the right to limited liability. So your liability is limited to this entity; it does not, carry on to other partners or shareholders. But if you get rights, then I think as a legal entity, you also earn responsibilities. And the responsibility is that you have to play a role in society like any other entity would, whether you're an individual or any other organization. So recognizing that the legal construct that you have gives you rights and responsibilities means you cannot shy away from responsibilities. You have to have stances, you have to have points of view on pretty much everything because you've been given that form. The second issue to me is really the issue of agency. So, how often do you, to what extent can you, say as an agent, I really don't have free will? And the best example of this, everybody knows, has come up often, is if you're a German soldier in the Second World War in the army, is it legitimate for you to say, I'm a soldier, I'm doing my duty. It doesn't matter what the Nazi regime is doing because that's not, I'm an agent. And most people would argue that at some stage, agency theory breaks down. You need to have personal will and personal responsibility as well. And therefore, again, I believe that as companies, you cannot just rely purely on the fact that I'm an agent of the shareholder. You need to have some will and responsibility. But I think for me, the third and most important argument, which is the most cogent, is that at its heart, I really don't see too much conflict between stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder value, and shareholder value. I think the distinction is only a distinction of time frames. And this is why. What happens is most companies eventually survive not just on a regulatory license or shareholder capital, you rely heavily on a license from civil society. You exist because societies and civil societies think you serve a purpose and want you to exist. If in the long term societies start thinking that you are not necessary or you do not bring value, you will not survive. And therefore, if you want to serve the shareholder interest in the long term, you must consciously recognize that you need a license from civil society for the long term. And therefore, the minute you change the time frame from a quarterly result to long-term results for the shareholders, you start squaring the circle very easily. The only way you can create long-term shareholder value is you must be around for the long term. And for you to be around for the long term, you'd better be serving a decent social purpose, otherwise you won't be around for the long term. So I find it easy to square the circle when I just change the time horizon to 10, 15, 20, and 30 years, as opposed to what happens in the next quarter.
Piyush, just to build on that, what about the idea that perhaps serving stakeholders, as we like to call them, or maybe even I would say, contributors, your employees are concerned about that. They are more motivated to come to work when they buy into an organization. Your customers are more loyal and trust your brand more, right? Your communities start to also value you as a good citizen. Do you think pursuing these goals can actually be profitable for you even in the short run? Because if you look at what Spotify and others have happened in the recent times, you see when companies steer away from thinking about these questions, they have employee rebellions, you have customer rebellions. So increasingly, you're seeing a more vocal stance from people around the organization if you are not willing to take some of these positions.
Well, that's true. And they can be profitable in the short term, but they won't always be. So let me give you an example which spells out the point. We have about 5 million customers in Singapore. And again, very early on, the data was quite revealing. We lose money on half of them. Actually, more than half. 3 million of the 5 million we lose money on. And that's because they're migrant labor. There are people who come into Singapore to do domestic staff work. There are people in the heartlands who don't earn money. They don't borrow money. So if I did a P&L on those 3 million customers, it is quite clear from day one they're loss making. I could have improved the profitability and the ROE of DBS very early on by basically shutting down and stopping offering services to large numbers of these customers. In the short term, there was no way to drive incremental profitability from that. However, it is also quite clear to me that DBS is DBS because we serve this entire customer base. We are the people's bank. We're the bank of the nation. We benefit from the trust it gives us. We benefit from the brand positioning it gives us. And frankly, we collectively believe this is the right thing to do. If we're not going to do this, who's going to do it? So, however, it took us a long time to try and convert this 3 million customer base from being a loss-making drag to at least being break-even and eventually making some small money on. It's not obvious. You've got to work at it. Now, you could argue that there's some other places where the profits show up, but the line of sight is not always easy. So you sometimes do have to make trade-offs. How you make those trade-offs is actually important. But I haven't read your full book. I read parts of it. And I have to say, a couple of your ideas, which I love, a couple of your ideas don't rest entirely easy with me. You sort of have win-win stakeholder capitalism as a nice but not adequate kind of thing. I think it's not always easy to get much beyond that personally.
Piyush, let me ask you then, this is that how, you have had excellent financial results. So it's easier for you to talk to your shareholders and your board. How do you sell this idea of a better world to your board and your shareholders? What do you say to them that, oh, we're building a better bank for a better world, best bank for a better world?
The time frame question. So for me, Ranjay, and I'm sort of fortunate, I have a strong anchor investor. Temasek owns 30% of our shares, and Temasek takes the long view. I'm also fortunate to be at a point in time when many other shareholders are willing to take the long view. And the fact that you have to price externalities and you have to look 10 years out. But to me, the best way to reconcile the shareholders, stakeholder said, is to get people reconciled to the view that in the long term, what is good for the shareholder is to make sure that you're working on things that are good for the country, society, community, employees, etc. And if people are convinced that this is a better long-term strategy, you will have they will have your back.
I want to switch topics now and talk about the transformation journey of DBS over the last decade or so. Right? As you think about kind of the first wave, which was called the Asian wave, you try to really start with saying, look, we are a very purpose driven bank, but, we need to be more customer oriented. We need to really kind of go from being a slow bank to being a much more responsive bank. And you wanted to kind of instill a kind of a cultural change in an organization. Culture change is not easy. People normally resist such changes, especially you're going to risk their jobs and careers. How did you as a leader have to deal with this resistance, natural human resistance? And how did you have to inspire them to be more courageous and actually be more courageous in their own lives and overcome the fear that comes with change?
Yeah. So, Ranjay, first I'll make one observation, which is again not necessarily music to everybody, but I think purpose is crucial, but purpose is not sufficient. So I would never fault DBS for purpose because, like I said, you go back year after year, decade after decade, the idea that you need to do real things for real people, be relevant to society, community. DBS is never strayed from that. Despite that, DBS went through decades of underperformance. And therefore, paying lip service to purpose does not necessarily translate into consistent performance and great outcomes. To convert and get the balance right, you really had to focus on what does it take to really create a top class bank. It's not just a statement of purpose. It's just not a belief. It is actually translated into capabilities and a way of working. I found, as you correctly said, we've had three waves to our journey. The first was we called it the Asian wave. And the idea there was really to just get some clarity around strategy. So we put some OB markers, we'd been in the previous period, we'd been all over the Middle East, we'd been all over Europe. It just seemed to us that as given where we were coming from and our strengths, just to focus on Asia and build a commercial banking franchise in Asia would probably be the most sensible thing to do. So we put some OB markers. But the second thing we realized very early was that our plumbing, what it takes to run a good organization, was not as good as it needed to be. Whether it's technology systems, management, measurement systems, policy frameworks, we were a little bit all over the place. Sometimes I used to say we were an overgrown Singapore bank. We'd gone out of Singapore into the region, but we not built the toolkit and the tooling to allow us to really become a multinational company. So we had to do some of that. But I guess the most important part was what you were alluding to. I found very early that coupled with the purpose, if you sharpen the purpose to customer centricity and customer obsession, that really liberated our people and liberated the capacity to take risks, to be innovative, and to make the right decisions. And as I look back, that's been the single biggest thing that's worked for us, really dedicating ourselves to putting the customer at the center of everything we do. I know, again, it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's worked for us. We started running process improvement workshops, the GE lean process. We very quickly embraced customer journey thinking, the Clay Christensen work on job to be done. And then we just ran it through the company. We trained people on outside in thinking, on journey thinking, on hackathons, and we made it de rigueur that you had to constantly think of the customer journey, instrument it, and think of the customer journey. That really translated into massive change at the employee level. So, when people talk about, who comes first, employee, customer, shareholder, etc., for me, the proof has been that if you relentlessly focus on the customer, it liberates your employees. And the employees wind up responding and behaving in ways that you would not be able to get them to do, just by sending them emails and telling them you need to do stuff differently. Uh, that part of the journey is important because it created confidence in our people that we could do stuff. Again, the story I've told people, my first 100 days, I tried to set up this vision of what our Mount Everest should be. And I wanted to sort of tell people that, less than 5 years, people should recognize us as Asia's best bank. And I couldn't get people to sign up. And reason for that is that we were coming from a place where it seemed extremely hard for us to even qualify as Singapore's best bank. And so we Mickey Moused, and our vision statement for phase one was to be the Asian bank of choice. Like, I figured, it's easier to be bank of choice than be best bank. 5 years later, 2014 or 15, when I got the 300 people together again, it was on a beach in Phuket, and we started talking about, where do we go from here? We thought we'd broadly been recognized as Asia's best by then. It was a ground up feeling and belief and faith that we could be the best bank in the world. That shift from not even saying we could be Asia's best to now saying we will be the best bank in the world. That belief and faith, I think the roots of that are in being liberated by the customer journey and the customer obsession approach that we took early in the game.
So, Piyush, everyone talks about being customer centric, customer obsessed. Amazon has, of course, broadcast this everywhere. It's a wonderful thing. I have to tell you, my last book 10 years ago was about customer centricity. I was on the same bandwagon. But it's how do you translate that talk into action? How do you get emotional buy in, people recognizing and allowing their daily actions to be informed by that point of view? That perspective taking, that empathy for the customer, and then putting KPIs around that too. So how was it some hard levers, some soft levers? Uh, what were kind of markers of that journey?
Everything, Ranjay. So there's the hardware and the hardware, we called it. On the hardware side, again, early we came up with service value promise. We called it RED, to be respectful, to be easy to deal with, and to be dependable. And it wasn't just a mnemonic. We spent again several days with hundreds of people to think about what would make us different. What would Asian service really stand for? And then we went to town for 2 years. I mean, everything we talked about was red. And red's a cool word. You can redevelop, redefine. Everything starts with red. But you got to do a lot of that. You got to, walk the talk. You got to get people focused on the empathy component. But you also got to do the hardware. One of that is instrumentation. You oftentimes rely on customer surveys. What does the customer say? Today, with digital, every customer leaves a breadcrumb or digital trails all the time. And if you're well instrumented, we call it customer science. You know exactly what the customer is doing. You know exactly where the customer is dropping off, why the customer is dropping off, what's not working. So how well do you instrument your systems, and how do you make sure you design for instrumentation, design for this thing? So that's a big component of the hardware, if you will. Um, a large part of this is the signaling. So let me give you an example. It's again, a lot of people have done this. So it's not rocket science, but I found very early that one of the biggest source of calls into our call center was people wanting to be able to waive fees for various things, typically credit card fees and a whole bunch of stuff. And the way our process worked, we had kids at the front end, kids who'd been trained 2, 3 months and put on the phones, and they were not given any authority to do make these decisions. So they would sort of tell the person, "We'll get back to you." They'd go and talk to the bosses. The bosses would talk to the bosses, and so on. And altogether, this whole thing would create a lot of angst in the system. So early on, when we started thinking about this customer piece, um, the team got together and we asked the question. So let's assume we get it all wrong and we give up all the fees and it's all wrong. How much is it going to cost us? And somebody said maybe 4, 5 million bucks. And I said, okay, fine. That's a 5 million buck check. I'm writing it right now. We will spend the 5 million bucks. Let's see what it does. Now, those kinds of stories start becoming legendary. People figure you're not focused on the PNL and the making money at the margin, but you're happy to give it up because it makes the right sense for the customer. That again is a great signaling tool. So we had a bunch of signaling tools around that. We focused on how do you put the customer at the center thing, recognition programs, award programs. I think all of these things come together, but I think you got to do both. You got to do the hardware and you got to do the hardware as well.
So now let me turn to the next wave, Piyush, which is the digital transformation of the bank. And I actually, again, met you in Singapore. You came and spoke to our AMP alumni reunion. And you had just met Alibaba and Jack Ma, and you were, I wouldn't say scared, but you had an awakening. And you came into the classroom and said, I've just had an epiphany. We're not competing with banks. Oh my God, we got to change. And and then the question was, how are you going to change a bank and get bankers to be like digital strategists? How do you get sheeps to be wolves, if you will? Tell us about kind of that part of that journey now, because now you're talking about really transforming the bank. It's one thing to say customer centric, be more responsive, fix the bank to do the basic plumbing of the bank. But now you're talking about a technology company.
Yeah. So, Ranjay, I mean, absolutely right. And I was scared. As I've been mulling over it, as as I said, I focus on internet one. I have some background in internet, intranet, etc. So not a typical banking CEO. Nevertheless, by 2013, a couple of things that happened. One, you could see the unbundling of the financial services value chain. The payments companies were coming up, the wealth companies. So I had an eye out on that. We tried to buy a bank in 2012. The regulations won't let you. So it was quite clear to me that the old-fashioned way of growing is going to be a challenge. But that meeting with Jack Ma was actually quite important. And after hearing his vision for what he was going to do with what was then Alipay, it wasn't even Ant, and how he was trying to take this whole agenda of using information and data to revolutionize the nature of finance, it blew me away. And I came back just thinking that, as soon as these guys start coming out of China into our neck of the woods, we're going to be history unless we fundamentally rethink what does it mean to do banking or financial services. And so, we came up with this whole agenda to do a radical transformation. We called it the Making Banking Joyful program. And I'm a big believer in change by design, everything. So we really, designed for three components of the program. The first was, how do you get to really be a technology company? And my CIO, he came up with this great mnemonic called Gandalf. And everybody calls these companies the FANGs. My CIO figured there was Google, Apple, Netflix, LinkedIn, Facebook, Amazon, and it made a very cool Gandalf, but it lacked a D. And so, you know what, DBS should be the D in Gandalf. Now, this is powerful because the idea that our frame of reference needs to be Google, Amazon, and LinkedIn, and not JP Morgan, HSBC, or Stanchart, that was a very, very bold step to make. And we had a lot of people even within the company who were very doubtful about whether we can be a technology company. To me, however, this idea that in tomorrow's world every company is a tech company became supremely important. I mean, is Uber a taxi company or a tech company? Is Airbnb a tech company or a hotel company? And therefore, getting people to buy into the fact that we have to constantly think about what will Amazon do and how will Alibaba deal with it. That's crucial. And so this technology company idea was important. It meant we went around the world, we learned things from them. We figured how to modernize our tech stack, move to cloud native. We figured out how to be a learning company. We figured out experimentation from Netflix. We figured out from different companies, and we said we got to take these toolkits and leverage them inside DBS. So that was pillar one. Pillar two was really doubling down on what I'd already started, which was the customer journey idea. And we were quite clear that, the tech company, when you said about Amazon, I've struck in our discussions with Amazon by the learning that Jeff Bezos would not let you talk P&L in a meeting. The only thing he let you talk was customer outcomes. So we figured that we'd have to take our customer journey thinking and customer obsession and instrumentation to yet another level. And to do that, we've got to train people even more than we've trained people. So we, started running a bunch of these different kinds of hackathons and training things and outcomes to double down on this customer obsession idea. And the third pillar was this internal culture change. I'd spent 3-4 years trying to convert DBS to a multinational culture, meritocratic and so on. I figured that the world of the future, I've got to change again. And we converted to a startup culture, which is nimbleness, agility, agile at scale, experimentation, risk taking. That's a very different kind of culture.
How do you do that, Piyush? No speech will do it. I know you have a speech on the beach we had talked about, but how do you get emotional buy in when the natural human instinct response is fear? Right? Change elicits fear, especially this kind of where I don't have the skills. I'm a banker, not a technologist. I don't have any technology background, and Piyush is telling me that we're going to be a technology company.
So, Ranjay, insight I had, that's your sheep to wolves analogy, is all of us, and we talked about every one of us has changed in our personal lives. The way we listen to music, read books, call taxis, do our banking, do our tax return, everything has changed. And we're all 40, 50, and 60 years old. My father is 90 years old. He's doing everything online. So when all of us can change in our personal lives, then obviously there is no limit to human capacity to change. So what you said is not a function of can I do it or is it possible to do. The real challenge is fear, what you correctly said, and the capacity to learn on the job. The difference is we do it. If I take a mobile phone, you got 40 apps you weren't using 3 years ago. So if you can do that in your mobile phone, why can't you do that in your workplace? And to me, that idea that there is something else going on in the office which prevents you from making the same change, as opposed to your mental capacities, that became really all consuming. We narrowed it down to two things. One is, adult learning. So in the at home, how do you learn? You download an app, your son, daughter, or somebody's going to come and show you how to use it. You use it a few times, you make a few mistakes, and then you figure it out. The problem is in the workspace, nobody's coming and showing you. Nobody's giving you the capacity to fool around with it and learn, and therefore you never learn. And the second problem is at home, risks are low. So if you can't figure out something, you'll find an alternative way to do it. I still remember in the early days of WhatsApp, my mother used to get so frustrated. The WhatsApp didn't go. It's a big deal. But in the office space, there is a high. Your bonus gets impacted. You get criticized. You don't get promoted, etc. So I figured the key things to focus on were these two. How do you make it easy to learn? And we came up, as referring to them earlier, with massive programs, hackathons, adult learning kind of thing, where we give people the chance to experiment and learn. My KPI for the company in 2016 was to run 1,000 experiments. And I kicked the tires. Every 3 months, I'd go to different parts of the company and say, show me what you did that you hadn't done before. What did you learn from it? We ran hackathons. We used to get teams of 15, where we'd have 13 DBS employees and a couple of startup kids, and we'd sort of give them a social problem to solve. And on the back of this 5-day effort, in house, we give them mattresses and beer kind of stuff. But they had to do whiteboarding, they had to do storyboarding, they had to do external, outside, and interviewing, and come up with an app which would solve a social or a business problem. And the two startup kids' job was to only code it for them. So by Friday, you could have an app that worked. I can tell you that if you're a 45-year-old mother and you have made an app and you can go home and show your daughter on Friday afternoon, say, hey, mom made this app at work, a light goes off, that I can do this, it's possible to do. The other thing was this idea of risk taking. We doubled down on giving people elbow room to go ahead and make mistakes. Again, and we made some movie markers. I don't want you to bet the company away. But at the same time, if it costs you some hundreds of $1,000 or something went wrong, we wound up awarding people for that. We screwed up something somewhere. The regulator came and they asked me to punish the person. I pushed back and said, not only am I not going to punish the person, I'm going to give them an award for at least having tried. And those kinds of stories then also go down the system and become and create a life of their own. That it is okay to take some risks, it's okay to make some mistakes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. I want to bring this discussion together and bring it back to you. We have all these kind of myths about a leader's life. It's lonely at the top. You kind of have to keep your own counsel. You have to carry the burden of all the issues and decisions in the company. Tell us about your personal journey. How have you grown and evolved as a leader? Who have been kind of the role model leaders that you have kind of drawn inspiration from that have really informed you as a leader today? Like, tell us about the arc of your own journey and where you are and where you hope to be.
Yeah, so Ranjay, everybody grows, and I've grown over time. I've always, enjoyed leadership positions when I was young, but I did the big change in my leadership, and it's a change which is also, indicative of the times. Um, I was generally used to be a top-down leader. I'm quite strategic. I can, think long term, and I'm very hands-on. So the helicopter leadership thing is my thing. I can go up, I go down, I go into the weeds, and therefore my style of leadership has traditionally been quite directive. I figure what to do, and I get people. I find the people, but I work to get things done. That's always been the case. And from time to time, you still need to do that. I say if you're in a battlefield and you're general leading the army, well, you need to lead the army from the front sometimes. But I've also found, and this is the big evolution, that I did not adequately appreciate or understand the power of collaborative and collective leadership. um, I did not really embrace the notion that culture does beat strategy. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, people have said. And over the years, I've found that to be true. That at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do as a person. There's only so much direction you can do. There's only so much execution you can do. There's only so much follow up you can do. There are 24 hours in a day, and it's a finite kind. Even if I build a team of 6 people, there's only so much we can do. The power comes from energizing and motivating a team of 35,000 people to be able to operate and deliver in and of themselves. When you get to the stage where you can get 1,000 flowers to bloom, when ideas come from the bottom up, when execution comes from the bottom up, then you really start getting outperformance. And that requires a very different leadership style. It requires a leadership style of collaboration, of trust, of getting people to be able to speak up, of psychological safety, what's now called a growth mindset. I think these are not just buzzwords. When you start creating these avenues in the company for people to learn from each other, learn from feedback, to be able to grow collectively, and to be able to take decisions, then you get a completely different rhythm. And then you also get much greater longevity. Then you're not relying on a small team of people who might or might not be there 3 years from now. Then you build something that is more deeply rooted, which can have a life of its own. I started feeling we're getting that to that place 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when I started hearing more about things going on all around the company, which were broadly aligned with our vision, but I had no knowledge of. I had never started. I had not this thing, and they were taking birth everywhere. That's a very different leadership style.
Last question for you, Piyush. I know that your successor one day would be chosen by your board, not by you. But as you imagine leaders for the next generation of DBS, what kind of leaders will it take to really lead this bank into the next wave, if you will, after you're gone? What kind of leaders, how will they be different than you?
I don't think very much. Frank, I had this big discussion at the board just recently as well. The notion that you'll only get computer geeks to be leaders, I don't think that's valid. Uh, the notion that you'll get people who, don't need to think strategy or don't need to think execution, I don't think that's valid. I think there's some things about leadership which are immutable. But I do think the last comments I made are important. The understanding and the appreciation of knowing that the customer experience and customer journey is changing and you have to evolve. When I started banking, it was okay to have 72-hour turnaround time. That's what banks did. And early in my career, I became a hero because of some products I offered the same day turnaround time. Now, can you imagine in today's day, if you typed something into Google in the morning and got a response in the evening, and you laugh at it. The fact is the customer expectation has changed and is constantly changing. So you need leaders who are completely embraced of knowing where is the world going and where is the bar for customer expectation. You need leaders who are technology literate at least, because a large part of being able to service customer needs and doing a business differently is you need to have an adequate degree of technology literacy. You don't necessarily need to know Python or code, but if you don't have appreciation for data, you don't have appreciation for this thing, that's going to be hard. But equally, you need to have the soft sciences. I said earlier, I think the big challenges are going to be of morals, ethics, and philosophy. So to be able to think your way through what is the right thing to do, what is the moral thing to do, I think that's going to define in many ways the winners from the losers. Now, these are not new things. In history, you always wanted people who can bring a bunch of these things to bear. I do think that one big difference is, of course, this whole collaborative leadership style. To move down from, the we at a point in time, when Max Weber created the pyramidical hierarchical structure, he created it to mirror Henry Ford's assembly line. Well, the assembly line is evolving, and so the pyramidical hierarchical structure also has to evolve. So you need leaders who are going to get comfortable with horizontal management. My big focus in the company right now is to transform the whole company from vertical silos to horizontals, to managing through journeys, through horizontal organizations, data-driven operating models, workflow engines, and all centered around the journey thinking and process. So you're going to have need leaders who drive and thrive in collaboration, on letting different people, distributed workforces, These are all things that are styles that are going to have to change. But some of the immutables of leadership, I think, are quite sacrosanct.
Piyush, this has been a most insightful conversation. I'll leave you with one last word, if you will. Who are your personal heroes or heroines of leadership? Like, did you encounter leaders in your life journey that you were deeply inspired, touched by? A teacher, a coach, or a boss, or a peer?
Yeah, actually, my first boss was very helpful in teaching me about people management. A guy called Bharat Sapeshkar. But I tell you, as a role model for me, and I'm going to caveat that, but it's always been Lee Kuan Yew. You know, he got a 400 square kilometer rock with nothing, and he created a world class country. He and his team created a world class country which completely punches way above its weight. Global reckoning, green, fantastic standards, non-corrupt, trusted, great financial center in 50 years. How do you do that? At the heart of that is what your book is about. Lee Kuan Yew's defining thing was the sense of deep purpose. He was guided by a single agenda. How do I do the right thing for this country and the people? And he just went to town with that one agenda. So I think for me, his intent and his capacity to translate that intent into what has been an extraordinary success is one of the greatest stories of the last century. Now, when the caveat is this, evolution from directive to collaborative leadership. Lee Kuan Yew is a very directive leader. People are scared of him, and he often said, I'd rather be feared than be loved. I don't think that necessarily works in the day and age we're going to. You'd have to moderate your leadership style to be able to get more collaboration impact. And for everything Lee Kuan Yew did, I do think there were some downsides with the model. I think the future would have to embrace the intent that he had, but be able to take a lot more people along.
Excellent. Piyush, I want to thank you. I know how busy you are. Thank you for taking the time to share with our alumni and guests your insights today. Really appreciate your taking the time, and I look forward to being in touch. I want the attendees to stay on. And Piyush, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be with us. Thank you very much.